Hello and welcome. I'm Joanne Lisosky, author and journalism educator. We are here to discuss issues of importance to the Caucasus. And with me today is Paul A. Goble, American analyst, writer, and columnist, the writer of the daily blog since 2004 called Window on Eurasia. He's a former advisor on Russian affairs to the Secretary of State, James Baker. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
The border conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan is again heating up. The details are unclear, but it sounds like it's a question of where the border lies. This becomes increasingly challenging because there is no official state borders in that region. Is this just a routine demarcation, or do you see this as a real power play? What's happening?
Well, the borders that existed in Soviet times were never as carefully drawn as we would like. They were moved frequently, including the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which was shifted a number of times over the last 50 years of Soviet power. The problem is that after 1991, Armenia and Azerbaijan were in de facto a state of war. They had broken diplomatic relations, and they did not conduct the kind of negotiations to delimit and demarcate the border between them. So that for the last 30 years, since the end of Soviet power, the border has been unmarked, and the question of where it actually lies is a serious one. The Soviets produced, near the end of their time, two maps of the border area between Armenia and Azerbaijan. One was produced by the Defense Ministry, and a second was produced by geographers at Moscow State University. The first one, which has it's an enormously broad scale map, shows the border in one place, favoring Azerbaijan, and the one that's on a smaller scale, produced by Moscow State University geographers, shows the border benefit in a way that benefits Armenia. Much of the conflict in the last week appears to reflect a difference, that Azerbaijan is relying on the old Soviet Defense Ministry map, saying that's the best map they have in terms of moving their troops around. Armenia is insisting that the topographic map is the better map, and therefore Azerbaijani forces, 250 to be specific, have crossed into Armenian territory. This problem wasn't a major one from 1993 until last fall, because during that period, Armenia not only occupied Karabakh, but also occupied a buffer zone around Karabakh, which meant there was no place where Azerbaijan and Armenia were actually next to each other. There was always a buffer zone, so no one had to worry about the border. Now, very much everyone has to worry about the border. One hopes that this will not lead to more violence, but the problem is that if the border is undefined, and if people believe that they have the most authoritative answer, there are likely to be clashes.
Which is going to be very unfortunate for everyone.
Sure.
It looks like the world has also taken notice of this border conflict. The U.S. has mentioned increased concern over these tensions, and President Macron of France has stepped into this with a tweet where he said the Azerbaijani forces have crossed into Armenian territory, they must withdraw, France stands with Armenia. And I understand also Pashinyan now claims that France is ready to send military support. How serious might this claim escalate?
Well, I don't think it very likely that France is going to send military forces, peacekeepers or otherwise, into the area. Nor is it the case that President Macron's claim or acceptance of the Armenian claim should be given full credit. The fact is, this border is as yet undefined by the two states. Borders have to be agreed to by both sides. At present, we are driven back to these two Soviet maps. To the best I can tell, and I'm not in the government anymore, so I don't have access to a lot of things, but to the best I can tell, the Azerbaijani forces have not crossed into Armenian territory as defined by the Soviet military's map, as defined by the Moscow State University geographer's topographic map. It's possible that they have. That's the problem. Those who want to say that Azerbaijan has violated Armenian territory are relying on one map, the map that Yerevan prefers. Those who want to say that Azerbaijan is not violating any border are relying on the Soviet Defense Ministry map. What this highlights is the need for intense bilateral discussions between Baku and Yerevan. And what it also underscores is something we've talked about before, namely that the declarations of November and January were just that. They were declarations. They were not full-blown agreements specifying all the details. Clearly, there should have been a recognition, even in November, that the issue of borders was going to become increasingly serious, because we now have places where Armenia and Azerbaijan touch each other, and that means the movement of forces on either side is a problem. It's especially a problem given that, at least we have reports from the Armenian side, that some local villagers are prepared to block highways and also are demanding that they be armed so that they can resist any Azerbaijani incursion. That simply raises the temperature. It's in everyone's interest to have bilateral talks about these borders. It's important to go back and do the tough survey work that will allow us to come up with a new border that both sides can agree to. I don't think that's going to happen quickly. I hope that both sides can agree to pull back from gray areas, if you will, so that there won't be clashes. But the most important thing is for the two countries, the governments of the two countries, to begin negotiations so that we can have a real border.
Thank you, Paul. It seems, curiously, Russia has had very little to say about this, Russia being the major broker of those declarations that you talked about earlier. Is this newest move by Azerbaijan a challenge to Russia, or does it in any way assist Russia in gaining more control of Armenian borders?
I don't think so. I think that Azerbaijan acted in complete good faith. It had a map that said this is Azerbaijani territory, and it moved its troops up. Russia is not in a very strong position to talk about borders. The joke in Moscow, of course, about Russia and borders is, where are the borders of Russia? And the answer is anywhere Russia wants them to be. And of course, Russian policy under Vladimir Putin has challenged borders in Georgia, challenged borders in Ukraine in ways that preclude the kind of agreements that that are necessary. So I think Russia has to assume a lower profile because it's not very credible on this issue. Also, I think it's true that the Russians don't want to offend either side, and so taking a position is hard. I hope the international community, in calling the attention of the world to the importance of an agreement on these borders, will recognize that the primary agreement has to be reached between Baku and Yerevan. But the only way that's going to happen is with international support that is broader than just Moscow. There have been suggestions by Russian commentators that Moscow should jointly chair a joint meeting between Baku and Yerevan on this issue. Having said that, I don't think Moscow is plausible I don't believe it should have the right to have peacekeepers on our Azerbaijani territory because it's already a party to the dispute, having a military base in one of the countries but not the other, and having armed one of the sides rather than the other, right up through the most recent conflict. The fact that the Prime Minister of Armenia appealed to Moscow to stop what Azerbaijan is doing shows how the Armenians understand the situation. I didn't see an appeal coming from Baku to Moscow asking Moscow to defend what Azerbaijan had done. I think Azerbaijanis feel they're in the right, and they are certainly in as much the right as anybody, since there is no mutually agreed border. I very much hope also, let me add, that Azerbaijan will take this opportunity to develop a cartographic service within the government and reach out to other countries that have large cartographic services to come up with better maps. One place that Baku might look is to the United States, where within the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, there is the Office of the Geographer that not only maintains maps and keeps records of border changes, but also publishes a regular journal on border changes, so that working with the U.S., I think Azerbaijan would find itself in a better position for any negotiations that eventually happen.
I wonder, is there such a cartographer in the United Nations or anywhere like that?
The United Nations has a office where agreements are filed, so that when two countries agree on their borders, they send it to the United Nations as a depository. But it's only as a depository. That is to say, it's like a library. If let's say Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan agree on their borders, they would send the agreement to the United Nations, and the UN would put it on file. But that's a different act than actually doing the research itself. It's not unimportant. It's important that these be registered, and one hopes that when there is an agreement between Baku and Yerevan on the borders, it too will be registered at the United Nations. That takes it out of being an issue of regional powers. At that point, it has a certain international blessing, but that's not the same thing as the kind of research that, say, the Office of the Geographer of the United States does at the State Department.
So you mentioned the military presence of Russia in Armenia, and it seems like there's an increased military presence in Zangezur now too. What does this portend for Armenia?
Well, one of the things is that there have been reports that the Russians are taking steps to create military posts in Zangezur, what the Armenians refer to as Syunik Oblast, and that these steps may lead to another Russian military base. One of the reasons for concern is that Russian forces in Karabakh, the peacekeeping forces, are in one part of the Russian chain of command. The Russian forces in Zangezur are in a different part. They were there as border troops. Armenia had, for some time, had Russian troops guarding its borders rather than Armenian troops doing it. So what that means is, I'm sure Moscow would take the view that anything its forces were doing in Zangezur was independent of the declarations of November and January. And that raises the question, could Russia simply create a military base, say the Armenians ask for it, on their territory, and that has nothing to do with the November and January declarations? They certainly could say it. It's something that Baku and others should be prepared to hear about. And it should also remind everyone, again and again, I keep saying this, but it doesn't seem to have gotten through to everyone, November and January were not agreements. They were declarations of intent. And the number of issues that are involved that have to be resolved to get to something like even a tough, peaceful coexistence environment between Armenia and Azerbaijan are enormous and large. And certainly the question of Zengezur is right up near the top. I'm convinced that one of the reasons that Baku decided to stop its advance at Shusha rather than go all the way to Stepanakert-Hakendi is that it was told it would get a corridor across Zengezur, which has been a major issue for Azerbaijanis since the beginning. They want to be able to travel on the ground from the major part of their country to the Azerbaijani autonomy in Nakhchivan without having to go through Iran. Anyone who visits Baku will see Azerbaijanis lined up at the consulate of the Iranian embassy to get visas so that they can travel from one part of their country to another. That's just simply unacceptable, unsustainable. And I think that when the declaration of November happened, November 9th, 10th, Azerbaijan felt that things were in place for them to get a corridor, and they were prepared to agree to other corridors, including between Armenia and Iran, as compensation. The problem was, and it remains true, if Azerbaijan could, if such a corridor were declared, Azerbaijan could pay for it and build it itself in a very short period of time. If you announce there's a corridor between Yerevan and Iran through Nakhchivan, Armenia has no money for that. So who's going to build it? When's it going to happen? And so what does that mean? Well, what it means is Yerevan has every reason to drag its feet for a resolution of Zengezur and the corridor Azerbaijan wants, because it can't build the corridor now unless somebody else comes in and pays for it. Who's that going to be? Well, it certainly isn't going to be Azerbaijan. Could it be France? Could it be Russia? Well, if that happens, then that raises questions of equity of another kind. So the failure of the November and January discussions and declarations to address issues of time, issues of financing, means that Zengezur is going to remain a hot topic for some time. Again, we need bilateral negotiations. We see greater international involvement. And that means not just Russia. That means the Europeans. That means the Georgians. That means the Iranians. That means probably the Turks and the Americans too. And that's something which Russia is very reluctant, trying desperately to prevent happening. But unless it does, I think the best we could come up with in the near term would be a return to a frozen conflict. And that's unlikely to last as long as the last one did, for the very simple reason that Azerbaijan has had very clear proof that it can advance whenever it wants to. I mean, that it was within hours, quite frankly, of occupying all of what the Armenians referred to as the Republic of Artsakh. And if the Russians and the Armenians try to prevent a Zengezur corridor, there are going to be people in Baku who are going to call for a move in Karabakh to change the balance in the region and to demonstrate what Azerbaijan can do. After all, under international law and by the recognition even of the Russian Federation, the area in Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan. It is subject to Azerbaijani sovereignty. The reason that Azerbaijan won't send its forces into Zengezur is that would be to cross an international boundary or international frontier, since we don't have an exact line, that would raise larger questions of the international system and might lead to intervention. But until we resolve the question of the maps, and until we get some real negotiations going, this is a very dangerous situation and is likely to explode at almost any time.
Thank you, Paul. What you've said too reminds me of something that you've suggested in the past, that we have just merely swapped Karabakh for Zangezur. What does this mean, that Armenia now has its own Karabakh?
Well, the thing is, it's like my idea, which goes back 30 years, was that Armenia could make a claim under the principle of national self-determination that the Armenian community in Karabakh could declare its autonomy under that principle. That came into conflict with the principle of territorial stability and stability of borders, but that was the principle. And my thought was that to avoid a conflict, it was probably going to be necessary for the international community to take steps to somehow recognize the rights of the Armenians in Karabakh to do that under the principle of self-determination, which, after all, the international community has always said it supports. Having said that, the question I asked myself and posed publicly now 30 years ago was, what could you give Azerbaijan that would make it willing to sit still for sacrificing what it considers its territory to Armenia? And the obvious answer is Zangezur, because that's the land bridge between Azerbaijan proper and Nakhichevan. So my thought was those should be, as a territorial swap could be arranged. Of course, what the international community quickly showed was that it was much more prepared to support stability of borders than it was to support a right of ethnic national self-determination, and it didn't go anywhere. That has worked to the benefit of Azerbaijan up to this point. But now Azerbaijan is close to recovering all of what was the Republic of Artsakh, the Armenian self-proclaimed Republic of Artsakh, and it wants to get in addition to getting its territory back, it wants to get a recognition of its new status in the world, and that means it has to have access on the ground to Nakhichevan, access that will link it more closely to Turkey, will expand trade between Central Asia through Azerbaijan to Turkey and Europe, and will change the geopolitics of the South Caucasus. Obviously, that creates problems for Iran and creates problems for Russia, but that's what Azerbaijan really wants. I think that's, as I say, that's why I think the promise of a corridor helped stop the fighting last fall. What we're seeing now is that issue hasn't gone away, that it's going to bubble up unless and until there's an agreement that not only draws a line that both sides will accept, but that makes very clear that the promised corridor between Azerbaijan proper and Nakhichevan is going to be built, and built relatively soon. That may require a matching timetable for the construction of the corridor across Nakhichevan for Armenia to Iran, but our Azerbaijanis need to be assured that their desire for that corridor is not going to be ignored now that we're 6 months away from that declarative language in early November.
Thank you, Paul. It seems like Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has been doing some shuttle diplomacy, I guess you'd call it that, in the area, visiting both Yerevan and Baku. What do you think was the conversation that went on between Lavrov and these leaders?
Well, I can imagine the content of the conversation in Yerevan more easily, quite frankly, than I can imagine the content of the conversation in Baku. I think that Lavrov probably delivered the message to Armenia that don't cause any trouble. because if you do, the Azeris will move, and we won't necessarily be there to protect you. So don't cause trouble. I mean, don't cause trouble. Don't ask for help. Just stay quiet, and eventually things will go to a new stage of frozen conflict. Our people are protecting the Armenians in Karabakh. We'll continue to do that, but don't push your luck. The conversation in Baku is a whole lot more difficult for me to imagine. I'm sure that Lavrov tried to say, well, I've been trying to rein in the Armenians to keep them from causing trouble. But beyond that, it gets pretty murky, because what the Azerbaijanis are asking for is simply that Russia live up to the provisions of its declarations in November and January. And if that's what Lavrov would say very clearly, I'm sure that Azerbaijani officials would have made that very clear immediately afterwards. That we didn't hear that suggests that wasn't said, and that in fact the conversations between Lavrov and the Azerbaijani leadership were a lot less substantive than people would hope for.
Well, and the thing that stood out, as you said, things that aren't mentioned means they probably didn't talk about it. And one of the things that weren't mentioned afterward was the Turkey and its joint monitoring mission. Has that been squeezed out? Did Russia squeeze Turkey out entirely?
Well, this is, again, there was a pledge to have a joint Turkish-Russian monitoring center. The idea was initially that it would be in Karabakh, either in Azerbaijani-controlled Karabakh or right in the part of Karabakh under control by Russian quote-unquote peacekeepers. Then it was moved at Russian insistence. The Russians said that there really weren't any good places for it in either of those locations, although that's very disputable, and they moved it to a village which doesn't have good transportation to and from anywhere, to sort of reduce its ability to do its job. It's receded in importance. I'm sure that the Azerbaijanis are going to ask that it be upgraded. I believe the Turks would be more than willing to put more people in there, but they want them to have something to do. And that's going to require that it either be moved or that the monitoring center be supplied with helicopters to allow its personnel to move quickly and easily around the entire area. Indeed, my guess is that Azerbaijan will now ask, jointly with Turkey, that the monitoring center get helicopters so that monitoring center personnel can go down to the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Syunik, Zengezur, as well as into Karabakh proper. So that's probably being discussed. I can't imagine that the Russians are happy about it. They didn't want the monitoring center. They've tried to prevent it being effective because they think if it exists on paper, the West will assume that it's doing something. But in fact, it's been gelded by Moscow policies, and I assume that both Ankara and Baku will make an effort now to expand its importance, not only well beyond Karabakh proper and all the way south along the Zengezur-Syunik area.
I wonder, do you think that the inclusion of any kind of Turkish military presence could mitigate this?
Well, if this had been a real peace agreement, and if there had been joint, since the Russians were clearly on the side of the Armenians historically, and the Turks and the Azerbaijanis are one people in two countries, as the slogan has it, neither Russia nor Turkey should have been peacekeepers. They're just, each is too close to one side in the conflict. But it certainly should have been the case that if Russia was being allowed to introduce, and it's now put in more than 3,000 military personnel into Karabakh alone, not to speak of what appears to be a significant upgrade in the other arm of Russia's military presence, that is the border guards for Armenia. These are Russian forces that are there, and those are the Zangezur Sunik people. That wouldn't have happened if Turkey had opened a military base in Azerbaijan or had scheduled more massive maneuvers with Azerbaijani forces. So the Russians, by playing this game, may in fact lead Azerbaijan to make more demands that Turkey step up to the plate, provide some balance against what is obviously a Russian effort to get more out of the conflict than they deserve.
We are moving into election season now in Armenia, and the elections, the snap elections, are called for in June. And Pashinyan says that these snap elections are the best way out of the current internal political situation. Do you agree?
Well, I think there's going to have to be, Armenia is going to have to come to terms with a new situation. It lost the war last fall. It was in danger of being losing everything. The Russians intervened and made some promises, which they now appear to be reneging on, that slowed the Azerbaijani march to complete victory. But that's not a solution. Could the elections are necessary to sort out the very complicated, messy political situation where you have far too many parties, nobody's all that popular, and which what you hope you'll get is the emergence of some leader who will be able to form a coalition, who will be able to speak with more authority, as well as be more honest with the Armenian people about what's possible. Pashinyan, quite frankly, has looked now like somebody who, having offended the Russians, is now acting as if he's totally dependent on the Russians, that the minute there's a problem, call Moscow. Well, Moscow didn't come through during the course of the fighting. It only intervened successfully very late in the game, and only by making a promise to Azerbaijan, which no Armenian government would have wanted. That is the Zangezur corridor. So maybe there'll be a new prime minister. It's not clear. Maybe, in fact, I think the most likely outcome of this round of elections will be another hung parliament with nobody having the kind of authority necessary to take the tough decisions that Armenia is going to have to take, because Armenia is going to have to recognize that it is in a weaker position now than it has been for a very long time. The Armenian self-concept is best captured in Franz Werfel's novel, The 40 Days of Musadah, that we are constantly surrounded by enemies, we are being pushed back, we have no choice but to fight, but we may lose anyway. Well, when you have a culture that thinks that way, if you want to hold on to something, you have to give people a vision of how you come back that's different than just fighting. Because just fighting, you will continue to lose. The balance is against you. And so that's going to take some real courage. It's going to take some real imagination. We'll have to see whether anybody comes out of this election in Armenia with the ability and the willingness to take the risks that will involve.
Do you think that this most recent sort of brush up in Zangezur is helping Pashinyan or hurting him?
I'm not sure. I mean,
Yeah.
First of all, I think the conflict is so confused, and I think that there's a recognition that both sides have arguments, although I suspect many Armenians are convinced that Azerbaijan is occupying their territory, just as Azerbaijanis are convinced that Armenians need to get out of the way of where Azerbaijani's territory belongs. But I don't see any rallying around the flag. I think that If Pashinyan were more popular, if he had been more consistent, then a conflict like this might lead people to turn in his direction as he's our man, we have no choice. But right now, they have a choice. They have a bunch of choices. And so I don't see it working that way, although I'm sure he hopes it will.
That's the assumption, I guess. I want to close by talking a little bit about what happened in the U.S. in the last couple of weeks, too. U.S. President notified Congress last week that he's extending the waiver allowing U.S. assistance to Azerbaijan, which is not unusual. But what is unusual is this occurred just days after Biden recognized for the first time the Armenian genocide. Is this genius diplomacy or a misstep?
Well, I think you have to understand what's going on here, and let's separate the two and then bring them together. President Biden used the word genocide to describe the events of 1915 in the Ottoman Empire for a very, very specific reason. It was not to punish Turkey or the Turkish world. Like many people in the United States who've run for president, Joe Biden, as a candidate, referred to the events of 1915 as a genocide. Others have done that and become president, and as soon as they became president, they've decided they don't want to offend the Turks, and so they don't use the term. President Biden has committed himself to being someone who lives up to his campaign promises because he wants to set himself apart from his predecessor, Donald Trump, who didn't. And this is about the decision about 1915 and genocide is about the United States, not about Turkey, and certainly not about Azerbaijan. It was taken because Biden, like many other American politicians and Americans generally, thinks that what happened in 1915 was horrible and that the word genocide is not necessarily inappropriate. Historically, the American government has been willing to say that, but Biden, because of his commitment to live up to his promises, his desire to show himself as the anti-Trump, this had more to do with Biden not being Trump than Biden not liking Turks. And I can't stress that enough. This was not taken to punish Ankara. One of the things that the Turks are often concerned about is that the recognition of 1915 as a genocide opens the question of reparations, opens the question of an international tribunal, et cetera, et cetera. It's worth noting that when President Biden made his official announcement, there was no reference to either of those things. So in other words, you got the word because Biden promised he would use the word, and he wants to be seen as living up to his promises. It wasn't because Turkey did something now that we don't like, and we want to show that. This had very little to do with Turkey and a whole lot to do with the United States. I mean, that's that side. The question of the waiver of 907 is also something which is very different. Excuse me, let me put it this way. It's very different. The United States can see clearly that in the South Caucasus, the balance of power is shifting, that Azerbaijan has always been the most important player, but now the United States can see that it is a regional power, and it wants to have good relations with Azerbaijan. Moreover, I think Washington has been encouraged by the fact that over the last 4 or 5 months, there have been a number of Azerbaijani political prisoners who've been released. Not all of them, certainly, but enough have to give encouragement to those in Washington who say we shouldn't be standing on 907. We should be cooperating with Baku. So I think that was about rewarding Azerbaijan. The declaration on 1915 as a genocide was not about punishing Turkey, and I think we have to keep those things separate. It's easy to come up with the old narrative that if you say something bad about the Turkish past, you're condemning Turkey. But in fact, the reason this was, I mean, Biden had said many times before becoming president that he believed 1915 was a genocide. He said it when he was running for president. Unlike a lot of people who become president, Biden wants to make sure everyone can see that he will live up to his promises. It's an American thing. I don't think that's fully understood in Turkey because I think people tend to be solipsistic on these things. But it's really, this one was really about us, not about Turkey. And the good news is that the waiver on 907 was not a deference to the defense industry in the United States. This was about deference to Baku. So Turkey shouldn't be all that angry about what happened. It was going to happen eventually. It just finally did. Azerbaijan, however, should be extremely pleased that a Biden administration would do this, given Biden's commitment to democracy, given Biden's lack of deference to the American defense industry. So it wasn't a local reward. This was a reward, and a not unimportant reward, to the government of Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much for your time, Paul, and your
Thank
insights. And I'm sure we'll be talking again. There's much to say about everything that we've already talked about today. Thanks for your time.